Asterisk, one of the things we fail to understand over and over again is that the world is far more dangerous and far more unpredictable than we'd like to admit. People want stability, they want certainty, but history, if you read it carefully, teaches the exact opposite. Nations rise and fall. Power is concealed, and then suddenly it reveals itself in ways that shock the global order. And here we are, facing the reality that America, perhaps the most dominant nation of the last century, has been stunned, unsettled, by the revelation of India's secret nuclear power. Now, why does this matter? It matters because nuclear weapons are not just tools of war. They're symbols of sovereignty, of responsibility, of ultimate power. And the psychological impact of a revelation like this cannot be underestimated. It shakes the very foundation of how nations perceive one another. It's the reminder that underneath all the treaties and the diplomacy and the speeches, there is raw existential strength. And when that strength emerges from unexpected places, the entire game changes. Asterisk, when power is hidden, it creates an uncertainty that is far more destabilizing than when power is openly expressed, because if a nation possesses immense strength but keeps it shrouded, every other actor on the global stage is left to guess, and human beings, whether as individuals or nations, fear the unknown more than the known. Think about it in personal terms. When someone tells you who they are, you might not like it, but at least you know the terms of engagement. You can adjust, you can plan, you can prepare. But when someone withholds their true capacity, when they keep their potential veiled, then every interaction is haunted by the suspicion that something much greater is lurking beneath the surface. That is the psychology of concealed power. And this is precisely why India's hidden nuclear capabilities have rattled the United States. It wasn't just the discovery of weapons, it was the discovery that they were there all along, unseen. That forces a kind of retrospective shock. What else have we missed? What else lies beneath the surface? It creates the recognition that the frameworks we rely on to measure global stability, intelligence networks, treaties, international inspections, are fragile, perhaps even inadequate. That is a profound blow not only to America's sense of dominance, but to the very assumptions on which it has built its order. You see, declared power operates almost like a contract. If you announce your weapons, your technology, your influence, you bind yourself to a certain pattern of behavior. The world knows where you stand, and the limits of your action are somewhat predictable. But concealed power is chaotic. It introduces doubt, and doubt is corrosive. It erodes trust, and in geopolitics, trust, even among adversaries, is absolutely essential. It's what allows deterrence to function. The Cold War did not descend into total destruction precisely because both sides displayed their arsenals openly enough to understand the consequences of pushing too far. But when strength is hidden, deterrence falters because no one is sure of the real scale of the threat. Now, at a deeper level, this also reveals something archetypal about human beings. We often underestimate those who appear quiet, who play small, who keep their cards close. And then, suddenly, they reveal themselves, and the revelation can feel catastrophic because it shatters the narrative we've built about who they are. That's true in personal life, in business, in politics, and it is no less true between nations. A concealed strength always carries the possibility of sudden upheaval. It is, in essence, the embodiment of the unknown, and the unknown is the one thing human beings are wired to fear most. So, when India's secret nuclear strength came into view, it wasn't just an event. It was a psychological earthquake, because concealed power, when revealed, forces everyone to realize that the world is far less stable than they thought yesterday. And that is far more dangerous than the weapons themselves. The shock that America experiences when confronted with India's hidden nuclear capability tells us something crucial, not just about India, but about America itself. Because you don't get shocked unless you believed you understood the situation. Shock is the violent collision between expectation and reality. It's the sudden realization that the model of the world you had in your head is no longer adequate to describe the world you're actually in. And when the world's most powerful nation, the so-called global hegemon, is caught off guard, it demonstrates a fundamental vulnerability. an inability to see what was right in front of them all along. Now, this vulnerability isn't simply military, it's psychological. America has built its sense of dominance on the assumption that it knows. It knows who has power, it knows where that power lies, it knows the balance of forces across the globe. But the revelation of India's hidden nuclear arsenal punctures that assumption. Suddenly, America doesn't know as much as it thought it did, and that's devastating because knowledge is the bedrock of control. If you don't know, you can't predict. If you can't predict, you can't plan. And if you can't plan, then your supposed dominance begins to unravel into chaos. There's another layer to this. Nations, like individuals, construct identities. America's identity has been that of the watchful guardian, the one who sees further, who anticipates threats before they emerge, who keeps the global order under surveillance. But being blindsided by India undermines that identity. It forces the recognition that perhaps the world is more complex, that rival powers are more cunning, that the U.S. isn't as all-seeing as it wants to believe, and that recognition is profoundly destabilizing because it cracks the myth America tells itself about its role in history. And here's the thing about vulnerability: when it's exposed, it multiplies. Rivals see it, allies see it, the domestic population sees it. America's shock at India doesn't stay contained. It sends a signal to the entire international community. If the U.S. can be surprised once, it can be surprised again. If it can miscalculate here, maybe it has miscalculated elsewhere. The aura of invulnerability, which has been one of the greatest weapons in America's arsenal, suddenly starts to dissipate. At a deeper psychological level, this moment reveals something universal. No one, no matter how dominant, is immune to being humbled by reality. The bigger the tower, the more shattering the fall when the foundation cracks. America, for decades, has operated under the belief that it is the indispensable nation, the center of the world order. But India's revelation reminds us that history is not static, and neither is power. To be shocked is to be reminded that the world doesn't bend to your will simply because you expect it to. So, America's shock is more than a reaction. It's a revelation of weakness. It shows the cracks in the empire, the blind spots in its vision, the fragility of its dominance. And those who are watching will not forget that. Because once vulnerability is exposed, it can never be unseen. When a nation like India, long considered a secondary player in the geopolitical order, suddenly demonstrates hidden nuclear strength, it doesn't just shift military calculations, it disrupts the hierarchy of the world itself. Because the global hierarchy isn't just about weapons or money or territory, it's about perception, it's about the shared agreement, implicit or explicit, of which nations sit at the top and which are expected to remain below. For decades, the hierarchy has been clear. America leads, its close allies follow, and emerging nations are given limited space to grow, but always within boundaries drawn by those already in power. India's revelation, however, cracks that structure. It says we are not bound by your definitions. We are not simply an emerging power. We are already here. That's a profound challenge to the established order, because hierarchies, once built, are fiercely defended. The nations at the top don't willingly give up space, and yet, history shows us that hierarchies are never permanent. They shift when outsiders develop strength that can no longer be ignored. The rise of India matters particularly because it wasn't anticipated in this form. Economically, yes, India's growth was visible. Culturally, its influence was increasing. But strategically, nuclear capability kept hidden. This was unexpected, and that makes the challenge sharper. It means that the old order wasn't watching closely enough, or it underestimated India's capacity for patience, secrecy, and long-term planning. That's a humiliation for those who assumed control of the global chessboard. Now, hierarchies aren't simply about dominance. They also provide stability. They give nations a sense of where they stand, of how far they can go without provoking catastrophe. But when a new challenger rises, that stability begins to wobble. Suddenly, the United States, China, Russia, those at the top, must reevaluate their strategies. Every alliance, every negotiation, every military calculation must be reconsidered, because the entry of a new, undeniable force into the hierarchy reshuffles the cards. And here's the deeper truth: hierarchies are not just political, they are archetypal. Every culture, every society, every community arranges itself into a structure of dominance and competence. The individual who rises within that structure always disrupts those above. That's why stories across history, from myth to religion to literature, tell of the outsider, underestimated and ignored, who one day reveals unexpected strength and forces the rulers to reckon with a new reality. India, in this moment, embodies that archetype, the underestimated outsider suddenly transformed into a central player. What this means is that the rise of India is not just a political event, it's a symbolic one. It represents the reminder that no hierarchy is eternal, that power is never fully secure, and that those who sit comfortably at the top must always watch the ground beneath their feet. Because if they don't, one day the ground shifts and the entire structure comes crashing down. So, India's rise doesn't just add another voice to the global conversation. It forces the conversation to change, and that, more than the weapons themselves, is the real shock to the established order. The significance of nuclear weapons is not confined to their destructive capacity. In fact, the actual use of such weapons has been avoided for decades precisely because their psychological weight is greater than their military function. A nuclear arsenal, in practice, is less about the detonation of warheads and more about the shadow they cast over every negotiation, every alliance, every potential conflict. They are symbols, terrifying, immovable symbols, of ultimate strength, and that symbolism carries as much force as the weapons themselves. Think of it like this: if two people are arguing and one of them pulls out a knife, the conversation changes instantly. The knife doesn't need to be used, its mere presence alters the psychological terrain. Nuclear weapons function in exactly that way on the international stage. Once a nation possesses them, every interaction is conditioned by the knowledge that there is a line which, if crossed, could lead to catastrophic consequences. The psychological barrier is often more powerful than the physical one. And here's where India's revelation matters. Until now, the global community largely perceived India as a rising but constrained power. Yes, it had influence. Yes, it was growing economically. But in terms of hard deterrence, the kind that reshapes international respect, it was thought to be limited. The sudden unveiling of hidden nuclear strength radically changes that perception. Overnight, India shifts from being a participant to being a decisive actor. And that's not just about the weapons. It's about the psychological reverberations those weapons create. The psychological dimension is crucial because it operates invisibly. Nations adjust their strategies not only based on the weapons that exist, but on the fear of what might happen if those weapons are ever unleashed. Fear modifies behavior. It makes adversaries hesitate. It forces allies to reconsider their commitments. It injects uncertainty into the decision-making of every actor on the global stage. That uncertainty in itself is a form of power, and this brings us to a deeper point. Human beings respond to symbols more strongly than to raw facts. Nuclear weapons are not just engineering marvels. They are archetypal representations of destruction and rebirth. They are the embodiment of what humanity most fears, the power to end civilizations. So, when a nation reveals it possesses them, it doesn't just gain military leverage. It gains psychological authority. It earns a seat at the most exclusive table in history, the table of those who hold the keys to humanity's survival. What India has done, then, is not simply to shift a military balance, but to rewrite the psychological map of the world order. America is forced to rethink its dominance, China its rivalry, Europe its alliances, and ordinary people, though far removed from the policy debates, feel a subtle tremor. The world is more dangerous, but also more complex than they believed yesterday. So nuclear strength, at its core, is never just about warheads or launch systems. It is about fear, respect, deterrence, and the reshaping of perception. And perception, in international relations, is power. Perhaps even greater power than the weapons themselves. It's tempting to believe that order is maintained when one power is so overwhelmingly strong that no one dares to challenge it. That's the dream of empires, after all. that sheer dominance will guarantee stability. But history shows us again and again that this isn't how it works. True order doesn't emerge from absolute control. It emerges from balance, when competing forces hold one another in check, when no single player can act recklessly without provoking consequences too severe to bear. Dominance, in fact, contains within it the seeds of its own collapse, because when one nation towers too high above the rest, the others inevitably begin to organize against it. They form alliances, they innovate in secret, they bide their time until the imbalance becomes intolerable. Dominance provokes resistance. Balance, on the other hand, creates the possibility of stability. It's a precarious stability, always under threat, but it is far more durable than the illusion of permanent supremacy. This is what makes India's rise so significant. The United States, for decades, has acted as though its dominance guaranteed global order. It policed the seas, it dictated economic norms, it intervened wherever instability seemed to threaten its interests. And for a time, that dominance did create a certain kind of order, but it was fragile because it depended on the assumption that no rival would grow strong enough to challenge it. Now, with India's hidden strength revealed, that assumption has been shattered, and the world is being reminded of a fundamental truth. Order is never the product of one power's will. It is the uneasy equilibrium between many. At the psychological level, this reflects something deeply human. A household, a community, even an individual psyche. It all functions best not when one element dominates completely, but when forces are balanced. Too much order without freedom, and you descend into tyranny. Too much freedom without order, and you collapse into chaos. Stability comes from the tension between them, the balance that allows growth without destruction. Nations are no different. A world dominated by one power will inevitably choke on its own authority, while a world balanced among several strong nations has at least the potential to sustain itself. And balance has another effect: it forces responsibility. When no single power can impose its will unchecked, nations must negotiate, must compromise, must think more carefully before acting. That tension, though uncomfortable, is what prevents catastrophe. It's what kept the Cold War cold, not dominance, but balance, the recognition that any rash move would bring destruction on everyone. So India's emergence is not simply a disruption. It may, paradoxically, be a source of future stability. Because as America is forced to acknowledge limits to its dominance, and as other powers adjust to the new reality, a new balance may form. And while that balance will be fraught with tension, it is tension, not absolute control, that sustains order. Order, then, is not the victory of the strongest. It is the fragile peace that emerges when strength is distributed, when no one stands so high that they cannot be challenged. That's what history teaches us, and that's the lesson America is learning today. One of the deepest lessons history teaches us, if we're willing to listen, is that no great power remains secure by ignoring those who rise beneath it. Time and again, empires have crumbled not because they were defeated in open combat, but because they underestimated the smaller, quieter forces gathering strength in the shadows. It's arrogance, real, the assumption that the world will remain as it is simply because it has been that way for a while, and arrogance is always punished in personal life and in the life of nations. Consider Rome at the height of its dominance. It thought the world revolved around its legions, its wealth, its order. Yet on its borders, so-called barbarians had gathered, underestimated for generations. Eventually, those ignored tribes became the very force that toppled the empire. The British once thought their empire would stand forever, but they too failed to recognize how colonial nations would rise from beneath them, demanding sovereignty, eventually dismantling the structure Britain believed unshakable. History whispers the same warning over and over. Do not ignore those who are climbing, because one day they will stand beside you or above you. This is the relevance of India today. For decades, the global order led by America largely treated India as peripheral. Important in some respects, yes, but never a decisive player. Its growth was noted, but not feared. Its ambitions were acknowledged, but not taken with full seriousness. And then, with the revelation of hidden nuclear power, India has forced a correction. It has announced, "You should have been watching us all along," and in that moment, America's shock becomes a reflection of its failure to learn from history. The punishment for ignoring an emerging power is not always immediate conquest. Sometimes it is humiliation. Sometimes it is the loss of credibility, the erosion of influence, the recognition that your vision of the world has already become outdated. And that's what America faces now, a moment where its confidence in its ability to foresee global threats has been broken, where it must admit that its dominance is not secure because it has failed to account for the rise of others. At a psychological level, this is the same principle that applies to individuals. Ignore your weaknesses, and they will grow in the dark until they destroy you. Ignore the quiet student in the classroom, and one day they surpass you in ways you never imagined. Ignore the creeping problems in your own life, and eventually they overwhelm you. Nations are subject to the same law. Neglect the rising powers, dismiss them as irrelevant, and you set yourself up for collapse when they reveal their true strength. So the lesson is clear: history does not forgive complacency. It punishes arrogance, it punishes blindness, and it punishes those who fail to recognize change as it happens. India's rise is not the first example, and it will not be the last. But for America, and for the world, it is a reminder. The future belongs not to those who cling to yesterday's hierarchies, but to those who are prepared for the powers emerging today.